Hi everybody, it's Mr. Matthew here, and this is video 1-3, so the third theme in the first unit for Honors Biology. In this video, we're going to talk about how ecosystems encompass interactions between living and non-living things. Specifically in this, we're going to get into the concepts of autotrophs and heterotrophs. In that means we'll also be talking about photosynthesis and cell respiration, getting a little bit into the movement of energy and the movement of matter within ecosystems. We'll also get into the concepts of looking into how when you break chemical bonds or form chemical bonds, there's going to be a change in energy. We will also get into the concept of a niche and what is an organism's niche, and we'll do a brief introduction of that. We will talk about energy flow through ecosystems and specifically get into some examples of the energy flow. This will lead us into a concept of the 10% rule, and we'll also contrast that with biomagnification. We'll then get into the concept of biogeochemical cycles with the movement of water, carbon, and nitrogen through ecosystems. And lastly, we'll get into factors that influence ecosystem stability and how those things relate to living and non-living factors within an ecosystem. We're going to be a little bit heavier on the living aspects, but we can talk about some other factors as well. All right, let's get into it. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to contrast the basic definitions of an autotroph and a heterotroph. You'll hear the word autotroph and the word producer used fairly interchangeably. In this case, an autotroph is going to synthesize its own organic molecules, which means it's going to undergo the process of photosynthesis. And we're going to contrast that with a heterotroph, which is an organism that is unable to generate its own food. However, it can ingest organic molecules produced by others. And you'll notice that light is the initial source of energy in most communities. There are a couple of examples of ecosystems that are driven by chemiosynthesis or some other some other different form of energy input. But for the vast majority of ecosystems that we look on the planet, photosynthesis is going to be our major source of energy. All right, so what does this have to do with an ecosystem? So we look at these two diagrams. These two diagrams show the relative energy of the reactants and the products in two reactions. So one of these reactions is going to release energy, that is our diagram over on the left, and the other is going to store energy, and that is the diagram over on the right. And so what I'd like you to do is pause and think. And in this pause and think, I would like you to assign each one of these equations to either being photosynthesis or cell respiration. So you got sort of a 50-50 shot on this one, but pause and think which diagram goes with photosynthesis and which goes with cell respiration. Okay, so hopefully you paused and thought about it, and you marked the diagram over on the left is a diagram of cell respiration. That is going to take the reactants of sugar and oxygen, and it's going to produce the products of carbon dioxide and water. And the net release of energy is going to be energy used by the organism that has broken down those sugar molecules, and it's going to use that energy to do something else. Over on the right-hand side, what we end up seeing is that we start with low energy molecules, carbon dioxide and water. And what we're going to do is we're going to put some energy in this case, it's going to be solar energy, to make some higher energy products, namely glucose. We'll also have oxygen produced as a result. And so this is going to be sort of that uphill reaction. We'll come back to chemical energy and reactions several different times throughout the year, but I wanted to introduce this from a graphical standpoint here, and we'll come back, as I said, in many other instances. Hopefully you have some other questions from this diagram, some of which we'll get to later in the year. All right, so this leads us into the concept of an organism's niche. And it might seem like a strange transition, but I've got this pileated woodpecker up here, and you can see that it's digging into a tree, and it's got a grub of some sort, and it's consuming it. So the question is, what are some words that you can use to describe the niche of this woodpecker? So before we go into it a little bit more, let me give you the definition of a niche. A niche is an organism's job, or all of the ways it interacts with the living and non-living aspects of the environment. So I want you to take a minute, and we'll have another pause and think here. And I'd like you to come up with 3 or 4 aspects of a woodpecker's job within the ecosystem. All right, so hopefully you realize that in the previous couple of diagrams or the previous couple slides, we were talking about the ideas of autotrophs and heterotrophs. So one of the terms that you could use for this woodpecker is to say that it is a heterotroph. It is a consumer. It is an organism that consumes other organisms. In this case, it's going to consume other animals or grubs. So one of its jobs in the ecosystem is that of a consumer. It is also an organism that is going to be preying or going to be a predator of certain types of insects. So it's going to keep certain populations of insects under control. You could imagine that some larger organisms could attack and kill these birds, possibly for food. I'm not sure which organisms that would be. You would also, if you remember from 1-2, it's going to have a niche where it's going to nest. So it's likely going to nest in other organisms or in other locations. So these are a couple of the things that you could put down for the niche of a pileated woodpecker. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to name every aspect of an organism's niche in every instance, but an organism's niche is an important way of describing how it fits within the ecosystem. Some organisms are going to have only a small number of connections or small number of obvious connections. Others are going to have many key important connections, and we'll come back to that later. It's also important to note that niches are unique. If you've got an organism that fills a niche, a very specific niche within the ecosystem, you can't have another organism also filling that same exact niche. And so if another organism, let's say another bird came in that competed in eating the grubs with this pileated woodpecker, and it was a little bit more efficient at doing that, you would see the pileated woodpeckers disappear from that given area because only one type of species can occupy a given niche in a given point of time. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about energy just in general, and we've talked about the concept of a niche, we can now look at the ecosystem as a whole and look at how energy flows through ecosystem. So obviously this diagram is a little flipped compared to the previous one, and what we see is that the sun is going to send energy to producers. Producers, or autotrophs, are then going to be consumed by herbivores. Also, when those organisms die, they'll be broken down by decomposers. And what we'll see is that herbivores are consumed by carnivores, and both herbivores and carnivores, when they die, will be consumed by decomposers. And decomposers will produce mineral nutrients that are in a pool, and those mineral nutrients will be usually taken up by producers. It is important to notice that the lines that are the yellow lines in this diagram show energy movement, and the non-yellow arrows, those black arrows, show mineral movement and are going to show matter movement, not energy. Okay, and so this is going to be a broad description. You'll notice that the herbivores, carnivores, and decomposers are all classified as heterotrophs in this case, and what we see is that there's a one-way energy flow from the sun to producers or to autotrophs, and then to heterotrophs. You never see energy flowing from heterotrophs back to autotrophs, and you never see energy going from autotrophs back to the sun. We will see that the nutrients, those mineral nutrients, do cycle, but the energy has a one-way flow. This sets up this concept that we describe as the 10% rule. Now, the 10% rule is just that roughly 10% of the energy available at a given ecosystem is going to be passed on to the next level of consumer in that ecosystem. So if we look at the diagram over on the left, we see this is described as an energy pyramid, and we have the primary producers. So those would be our plants in this case, or our autotrophs. Then those are going to be consumed by the primary consumers. These would be our herbivores. The herbivores are only getting 10% of the available energy of the primary producers. We're not going to get all of that energy. You might be going, well, why? Where did the other 90% go? And if you look at that a pentagon we have in the middle, it says that energy is lost as heat. As the plants go about performing their activities, they're going to consume energy as they're building molecules, as they're breaking down molecules, as they're carrying out their day-to-day activities. They're going to be using the energy that they're producing. They're both making energy and breaking it down. So as a result, not all of the energy that they take in from the sun is going to be available on that next level. Now, those primary consumers are going to do the same thing. They're going to eat their food, But not every bit of the energy that they consume is going to go to building more of that herbivore. Some of that energy is going to be lost as heat as they go about their daily activities. As a result, we see as we move up the pyramids, we see 10% being passed on in each level. Obviously, decomposers are outside of this, and they're taking energy as well. And the decomposers are helping recycling our nutrients. Now, the big thing to note about this is that you're not going to end up having a lot of apex predators or high-level consumers within an ecosystem because there's only a small percentage of the energy available at the producer level available for those. So if we were to apply organisms in this case, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of plants. You're going to have roughly 10% of the biomass of plants can be available in stuff like grasshoppers and other herbivores. You can have 1% of the plant amount in some small birds. Okay. And then in larger birds, as you move up, you're going to have even fewer of those, and maybe an apex hawk or an owl or something like that, where it's going to have very, very small numbers, only 1 or 2 of those for every, thousands of primary consumers that you ended up having, because you can only support so many apex predators in this case. Now, the other thing that's on this slide is this thing called biomagnification. Now, biomagnification is the opposite of what happens with energy. So as we said before, energy has this one-way flow. It goes from producer to consumer, and it dissipates as heat as we go. But as that heat dissipates off, the molecules, the matter that was in that primary consumer is going to get conserved. So let's say that primary producer pulls into it a heavy metal. Okay, because there's a heavy metal that was in the soil, someone polluted the soil, and that heavy metal gets in there. The primary producers are going to be consumed by the primary consumers. The primary consumers are not just going to eat one producer. So while there might only be a tiny, small amount of that metal molecule in each producer, the primary consumer has to eat many primary producers, and so we're going to see an accumulation of that metal in the primary consumer. Because the secondary consumers are going to do the same thing. Each secondary consumer is going to eat many primary consumers. There's going to be another concentration of those molecules as we go. And so what we can see here over on the right is how this works with specifically mercury in aquatic food chains. We have mercury that's coming off of coal plants and out of volcanoes and through runoff, and we get that in, and the mercury is being picked up by krill. And these krill are going to be very, very small, really primary consumers within this ecosystem. Now, each one of those krill are going to be consumed, each salmon is going to consume many krill. So what we're going to see is a larger concentration of this mercury-containing krill, or a larger amount of these mercury molecules in the salmon. The salmon is going to be eaten by a larger fish, such as a tuna. And so what we see is in that tuna, we're going to have like a much higher concentration because it's eating many salmon. Each of those salmon ate many krill. Each of those krill had mercury molecules. And so we see this increase in mercury concentration until we get to one of those giant fish over there on the far left. And what we find is these giant fish are now going to have a very high concentration because they had to eat many of the large fish that ate many of the salmon, that ate many of the krill, and the mercury concentration goes up. So what they say is if you want to go out and eat some of these smaller things, such as krill or pollock or oysters, you can eat unlimited amounts of those because, while, yeah, there's a little bit of mercury and we haven't seen the biomagnification, a concentration of that. As you move up to larger fish, you need to think a little bit more about how often you should eat those, because these fish are likely going to have a higher concentration of mercury because each one of those fish had to consume many smaller organisms, and therefore they would have concentrated that even more. When you get to the very, very large organisms, you have to be very conscious of this. And if you think about this, this is why actually pregnant women are recommended not to eat certain types of seafood at all, because mercury levels end up being concentrated in them, and pregnant women, and more notably the developing embryo or fetus, is going to be a little bit more susceptible to this metal poisoning than the average person. All right, so this now gets into that idea of matter doesn't go away. It doesn't dissipate. And what we end up seeing here is we end up seeing these in what we refer to as biogeochemical cycles. So in our particular instance, we're going to look at 3 specific types of biogeochemical cycles. Over here on the left, we have the water cycle, and I'm sure you are familiar with the water cycle because you have seen the water cycle many different times at different grades where you've studied the movement of water. And that's going to involve, precipitation and runoff. And then we're going to see evaporation and transpiration leading to condensation and then more evaporation. And that's your typical water cycle where water is moving through the different states of the ecosystem. We also have a carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle is going to be a little bit more complicated, and the carbon cycle is going to involve the small amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere. It is going to be released to the atmosphere through release by CO2 as organisms undergo respiration. There is also going to be the burning of fossil fuels, burning of wood. We'll see a release of that. We'll also see farm animals will release CO2 out into the atmosphere. CO2 is taken up by plants. It also gets drawn into the oceans. And what we see is that we have an ocean acidification that will occur as ocean waters will take up. And overall, we'll see here. The nitrogen cycle is the movement of nitrogen. And so what we see is most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Nitrogen is taken up by nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live inside legumes such as peas and beans and clovers, and that's going to help make that available for certain plants. It's also going to be turned into ammonia through ammonification by bacteria. Decomposers will also help break down and produce ammonia that gets into the soil. Ammonia is going to be nitrified, again, by nitrifying bacteria into nitrites, and nitrites are going to be turned into nitrates by other nitrifying bacteria. And really what we see is the nitrates, and for certain plants, the nitrogen that's made available through ammonia is going to be taken up by different types of plants, and that's going to be how we get it into the food chain. We'll also have, again, decomposing bacteria and denitrifying bacteria, which will help make nitrogen available back into the atmosphere. It's important to know that in each of these cases, what we're seeing is matter is changing from one state to another. It's neither being created nor destroyed. And unlike energy, it's not being lost anywhere. Those molecules have to go somewhere. And so they go from one phase to another as they move through the ecosystem. And this leads us to our concept that we have is what leads to ecosystem stability. And so when we talk about ecosystem stability, there's a couple of key factors that we'll look at. One that's not shown on this diagram is the idea of the size of an ecosystem. So the larger the space an ecosystem takes up, generally speaking, the more stable it is. What is also shown on here, and if you look on the diagram to the left, you see a lot of different types of plants, and that's going to highlight the concept of biodiversity. The more different types of organisms you have in a given area, the more stable it tends to be. Over on the right, we see that there's much fewer plants shown in this field, and in the back you have purple loosestrife, which I brought up in a previous video, and purple loosestrife is an invasive species that comes in and competes for the niche of many native plants, and it's going to reduce that biodiversity. So if we compare the diagram on the left and compare the diagram on the right, we'd see the one on the right is going to be less stable than the one on the left because of a reduction of biodiversity because of the introduction of an invasive species. In the middle, we have this apex predator, a wolf. And the reason I brought the wolf up is that the wolf, we have found out, is what is referred to as a keystone species. So in addition to having biodiversity, and if you remember earlier when we talked about the connections between organisms within ecosystems, certain organisms tend to have a disproportionate effect on an ecosystem as compared to other organisms within the given ecosystem. And it's not always super obvious. Like you might think, well, the major plant that's in a given area, that has got to be the keystone species because so many organisms either feed on it or nest on that. And that may in fact be true, but a lot of times keystone species are ones that, because of their unique position within the food web and within the ecosystem, they have a ripple effect on many other organisms. And this term comes from the masonry, where when you build an arch, you have a keystone that holds up the arch. And similarly, if you remove that keystone, the arch will collapse. If you remove or disrupt the keystone species, you will see an ecosystem will maybe not collapse, but will be dramatically shifted and possibly become a less stable ecosystem. So I'm going to put a link to a video here about how the wolves changed rivers. It's an interesting follow-up video that you may want to check out. It comes from a TED Talk, and it's a pretty cool example of how a wolf could in fact be a keystone species. So that's it. That brings us to the end of 1-3, and I will be back soon.